Welcome to the Sazmining podcast. At Sazmining, we are bringing you into conversations with today's industry leaders in blockchain and cryptocurrency. Our goal with this podcast is to improve the understanding and adoption of blockchain and cryptocurrency by giving you an insider's look at what's being built and informed predictions on what the future holds.
William Samasegi is the CEO and founder of Sazmining Inc. All opinions expressed by William or his guests on this podcast are solely their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Sazmining. You should not treat any opinion expressed by William as a specific recommendation to make a particular investment or follow a particular strategy, but only as an expression of his opinion. This podcast is for informational purposes only.
Today's episode is sponsored by BlockFi and Cogent Law Group. Our listeners can visit blockfi.com/sazmining for an exclusive offer for cryptocurrency management, and check out Cogent Law Group for all your legal needs. Benoy Thanjan is the founder and CEO of Reneu Energy, and he is also an advisor for several solar startup companies. He was the SREC trader in the project finance group for Solar City, which merged with Tesla in 2016. Benoy was the vice president at Vanguard Energy Partners. He also worked for Ridgewood Renewable Power. He has extensive financial experience in the renewable energy industry and in the environmental commodities markets. With all that said, I'd like to welcome you, Benoy, to the podcast.
Thanks, Will, for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to be here, and congrats on the start of your podcast. So it was great to talk to you about how it kind of happened and where you are today with it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've been very, very excited for this conversation in particular. I mean, your background is incredible. You're one of the experts in this industry, particularly in solar. And you also, as you mentioned, have your own podcast, the Solar Maverick podcast. To start things off, can you just talk about your journey in this industry and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. It's been an amazing journey, and I can't believe how quickly it's happened. I mean, really, my first job out of graduate school was at Deloitte & Touche, which was like an internship. And then I ended up getting a full-time job after the summer was over in their energy group, in their energy financial advisory services practice. And I was more on the sell side, consulting side, but I really wanted to move to the buy side. And I ended up going to a company called Ridgewood Renewable Power, where I ended up analyzing investments in renewable energy projects. And I thought at that time, that was like, wow, 10 years ago or 11 years ago, that solar is going to really grow exponentially based on my research. And then I wanted to get a job in the solar industry. So I ended up working at this company called Vanguard Energy Partners, which is an installer of commercial, industrial, and utility scale solar. And I was in their project finance group. And then I then went to Solar City Tesla. And that was like an amazing experience because this was before they were a publicly traded company. And I was actually, you mentioned SRECs, which are solar renewable energy credits. That's an incentive in the Northeast states to incentivize solar development. So I was helping Solar City with their expansion into the Northeast markets. And then I also worked for Lyndon Rive, who was actually the CEO of Solar City, but he was also head of the project finance group. He's Elon's cousin. So, it was just like really getting a great sort of experience. And then I decided to start my own company in 2012. We first started as a consulting company, and we also develop projects, and it's been now 12 years in the renewable energy industry. And you're considered a veteran, because it's such a new industry, as like what you are in cryptocurrency and mining. It's so new. So I could really, relate, because you're trailblazing a new industry and new services.
Yeah, definitely. Well, what you guys are doing at Reneu Energy is really, really interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about what what the projects that you're working on with Reneu Energy are actually like and how your company's involved?
Sure. So initially we were just a consulting company, and we're just trying to figure out how to add value in the industry. So we first got started in these REC markets, or SRECs. And basically at this point, we manage about like 12 megawatts worth of projects that we do like SREC management for. We also help our clients sell those RECs, and then we actually do research as well and pricing, because it's one of the big economic drivers of solar projects in the Northeast in the states that we're talking about. And then we also source financing for projects. So there's about 13 megawatts of projects under construction today where we've either helped the investor or developer in sourcing financing for the project. And then we've also now developed commercial, industrial, and utility scale projects. So we felt like 2 years ago that, hey, we're helping all these developers and investors in different parts of the puzzle. Why not? Why we should be able to do that ourselves. So we're actually doing the first community solar project with the New York Housing Authority on 20 different rooftops in New York City. And then we actually partnered with a European developer where we're developing 150 to 250 megawatts of community solar projects in New York, where we're basically, educating them through the process, partnering on different things. They have experience developing all over the world. And then, but New York and each state is just so unique when you're developing a project, which I'm sure you understand what you guys are doing as well.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that I definitely want to dive into more depth on, just after hearing about all the different business segments that you guys touch with Reneu Energy,
Sure.
is that financing piece, right? Because I mean, our industry, we're in cryptocurrency mining. There are different types of payback periods, different types of ways where you try and retire the debt over time compared to solar. How are you looking at the structuring of these different financial projects for these solar companies?
Yeah, it's extremely complicated and it's unique, and it depends on the counterparty and how a big part of the capital stack is like tax equity. And if people are not familiar with tax equity, that's basically you have to have a taxable income to take advantage of government tax incentives. So the big incentive in solar is like the investment tax credit. That's a 26% incentive on the cost of the solar system. And then there's accelerated depreciation, which I don't know how much I'll get into, but that really like impacts, the capital stack, and you obviously can't take debt against that. And then there's like sponsor equity. And then obviously everyone wants to put, as you know, as much debt as they can on the project for the longest term possible. But it really depends on like the quality of the offtake, which is always like a challenge. And I'm sure you experienced that as well, doing like the PPA agreements that you're working on, and having a credit-worthy off-taker and trying to figure out solutions if it's not credit-worthy, how to get the lender comfortable. And then also too, what's challenging too, what we're finding is most of these PPAs are getting to be more merchant and different sort of risk appetites. And we're seeing, like before it was like just a 20-year PPA, one investor, and that was the way that it would get financed. But now like we were talking about community solar, it's a residential customer who's buying the offtake, and they only have a 1-year commitment. And then there might be like an anchor tenant who basically takes 40% of the community solar offtake from the project. And that's only a 5 to 10-year contract, not 20 years. So what we find is that it's like all completely structured, completely different. And that's what makes it extremely challenging, but then also creates an opportunity for us to add these services to our clients. So.
Yeah, definitely. And on the point of view of how long these solar projects normally take to pay back the capital,
Sure.
Is that something where you're seeing huge variability in project to project, or is it a type of approach where that a solar project is normally going to be able to pay back the capital in X number of years, and so there's a somewhat understood approach in structuring these types of financial projects?
That's actually a great point. Well, what we find is it's like all over the place because there's so many different variables. It really depends on like what's the power price that's negotiated for the power purchase agreement. We talked about credit as well. If you're a Fortune 100 company, investment grade, it's a lot easier versus like a non-investment grade credit. The other thing too is like the state level incentive is unique in every state. So for example, like we're in New Jersey here, and they have like a 15-cent credit based on a megawatt hour production. So it based on that actually impacts as well, like how you structure the financing and how comfortable the financing is comfortable. So.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So from your point of view, I would kick myself later on if I didn't end up asking this question. So I'll ask it right up front because we have an expert in solar and renewable energies right here in the flesh. Many times you hear people talking about the environmental impact of these different types of energy sources. So renewables versus natural gas or some other type of non-renewable energy source. How would you, from your perspective, compare the pollution caused by renewables, such as something like solar, versus non-renewable energy sources like natural gas?
Sure. So, I mean, it's interesting because people call natural gas like a cleaner fuel. And it's true, it is a cleaner fuel compared to obviously coal, which, I'm hoping obviously people know that's like an extremely dirty source of energy. That might not necessarily be said in, by certain people who have prominent stature, but, it is not a clean source of energy. But yes, solar energy is a clean energy, but there is a pollution aspect of it when you're constructing the panel. And then actually in the future, basically a solar system or panel lasts 20 to 30 years. So right now, like most of them are actually going into landfills. Companies are coming up with ways of recycling certain components. So that's actually, it's definitely cleaner than like natural gas. But yes, there is definitely some pollution that's created with the construction of these panels. And then obviously the recycling as well. But I'm hoping, as solar is a relatively new technology, and there's so much solar coming online in the past 8 years, that we'll get better at recycling, and that will not be as big of an issue. The other thing too, it's an infinite resource versus like natural gas. Obviously the sun is shining, and there's so much electricity that's, if you think about it, it's untapped because you don't have really solar everywhere, which I think you'll see a lot more solar obviously over time. So that's like my thoughts about it. But that doesn't eliminate natural gas. I mean, it's still part of the energy equation. You're going to need multiple types of power sources. Solar, wind are very intermittent power sources. Obviously, with natural gas, it's a combined cycle that you could start at any moment. And obviously, like as storage becomes more prevalent, you'll see more intermittent power sources as well.
Yeah, definitely. And when you were going through that actually reminded me, and maybe it was because we were talking about Solar City earlier in the bio where
Sure.
you have experience, but I was reminded of this one, I think, speech that Elon Musk was giving where he was talking about how eventually we're going to have to make that move towards full renewable energy sources because there's only so much natural gas out there. Depending on whether you think it's going to get burned up in the next 100 years or 1,000 years, wherever you stand, eventually we're going to have to make that shift over to fully renewable. So, I mean, we can talk in whatever time scale you'd like and you'd prefer to answer this next question in, but from your perspective, what do you think that shift from non-renewables to renewables is going to end up looking like? So I guess boiling down that question, what's your view of the future of green energy?
Sure. Well, yeah. So I don't know when that actual transition that he's talking about is going to happen because right now natural gas is extremely plentiful on the earth, specifically even the United States. And then also the technology is actually getting a lot better where we could actually drill a lot deeper. So like the excavation, but the interesting thing is solar is actually getting cheaper as time goes on. And I think it's going to be a mix of different fuel sources, intermittent power sources. And what I would say, everything's going to be distributed in the future. It's not going to be, you have a big power plant and then, it goes through transmission distribution lines to your home and you're turning on your electricity. How it's going to be is it's going to be localized and distributed energy, where people will have solar panels on their roof, maybe even small wind turbines, and then there's some sort of storage facility that's going to be there. So I see it as a combination of, solar, wind, and storage. And there'll be obviously other technologies. There's biomass, landfill gas, which, obviously that's like more pollution because you're doing, wood burning and garbage as well. But as we recycle more materials, I think then you have like hydro. So I think it's just going to be a mix of different fuel sources and then using storage and microgrids and other ways of where it's just going to be localized and distributed energy. I just don't know when the time frame of that's going to happen. And I know people are hesitant to talk about nuclear after Fukushima, but that as well as a renewable resource as well, and maybe that actually comes back because it could generate such electricity. And I think there's going to be other technologies that we are not aware of that are going to basically come in the future that are renewable resources. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see how much innovation is really going on right now. I mean, you touched on one with battery storage and how that's going to absolutely change the game as those batteries get better and better and you can store more and more energy. And then there are many other technologies that are being developed right now. What are some of those technologies that you've seen or that you've heard people talking about that you're most excited about?
Sure. So it's funny. I mean, just because we're in renewable energy, it's hard for me to keep track of all the different technologies that are happening. And then so many people are reaching out about trying different things. But, I'm still like focused on like the core technologies. Like, as you mentioned, Will, like battery storage to me is going to be a huge game changer. And specifically like lithium ion technology, that's really the technology that you're seeing most prevalent with Tesla and all the other major battery manufacturers. And the crazy thing is, like, we're seeing huge exponential decreases in the cost of the batteries. So I believe in 2 to 3 years, it's going to be a lot more economical than it is today. And you're going to see as well, like electric vehicles are going to be a lot cheaper in the very near future because the real cost related to the vehicle is related to the battery. So what's crazy to me is like, right now you could get a Tesla at 35,000. I think, it'll be a lot cheaper than that in the next 2 or 3 years, which is pretty amazing. Then solar as well. I mean, the technology within these panels, it's just amazing as well. It's just every year the panels are getting more, having higher capacity, and they're also getting bigger, meaning bigger as far as like the kW. So it's just shocking to me. Like, I just can't believe how quickly like the prices and the efficiency. It's the same thing we were seeing with like battery, with computing power, you're seeing with solar panels. So, I mean, I know this is not like everyone's kind of heard like about these technologies, but I think within these technologies, like there's a lot of technology, like innovations that are happening with like bifacial panels and other things. And it's just really exciting. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about also how once you suddenly introduce this new technology, how that's going to change the business landscape. So, I mean, one, battery storage, that's obviously going to change the way that that pricing on energy looks across the entire industry. But then another thing you mentioned was with EVs. I mean, these electric vehicles, when you have better batteries, all of a sudden it's much more economical for you to go and buy an electric vehicle versus going towards some sort of, I guess, the vehicles we're all used to today. I mean, what my dad's actually working on things in the EV space, and we've seen that a lot of these car manufacturers are really seriously trying to move towards electric vehicles and are playing catch up now to companies like Tesla, who've been developing this technology since their inception.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And also the cost, right, of the fuel from the electric vehicle is a lot cheaper than oil. So it's just, I think it's going to be amazing, like EVs and the electrification of the car fleet. I think you're going to see very quickly. And I think China is requiring by 2030 all cars to be electric, which is not that far away if you think about it.
Yeah, that's crazy. In like one decade, all cars being electric in China. Actually, one thing, I'm glad you brought up China for this discussion, because I mean, the Chinese have played an enormous role within the development of solar energy. And it's kind of, I really want to just hear your perspective. Can you talk about how you view the importance of regulation and the different approach that these different countries have taken towards regulating your particular industry, how that's changed the competitive landscape between the companies in the US versus the companies in China?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a great question. That's really like interesting to me because, China is very different to the US when it comes to energy policy, specifically like renewable energy policy. I mean, if you look at like electric basically electric, energy storage. China, the government has invested so much money into helping these. I think there's a part of China, I forget the name of the city, where it's all basically energy storage manufacturers, and they've helped invest into that technology, like billions of dollars, because they believe that it's going to be the future. This is the same thing as well that they have done with solar panels, and which is interesting because it's like the polar opposite in the U.S. Like, yes, the investment tax credit that I talked about is a huge incentive related to energy and solar. Now there's actually a standalone, hopefully, incentive for the investment tax credit, but there really hasn't been like a national sort of energy policy. And in the US, when it comes to renewables, it's more been state by state, which is great that the states are taking that initiative, but it creates so much complexity because each state is totally unique into itself, and there's a huge learning curve. They also don't have the money, and maybe the US government doesn't have the money as well to be able to be investing in all these different things. But I think really like China's looking at it as like a competitive advantage as they transition to renewable energy and energy storage, which I believe is a competitive advantage. But I don't think at this point, like the US has taken an active role. But what's been amazing though, is we still have like, leading companies in the industry. We're continuing to adapt, and, we might not have the same resources from like the government, but it's still been extremely creative, like the solutions that US companies have come at when it comes to like panel technology, obviously energy storage. So
Yeah, definitely.
Even financing.
And that's one of the things too, that I had heard that essentially a lot of the thoughts that you just laid out echoed, where the companies in China had that sort of an advantage from the available financing to be able to grow. But a lot of the actual innovation that was happening with US companies. And so it's really interesting to see how the competitive dynamic is continuing to play out, because I mean, this is technically still an industry in its very early stages. And I mean, you're one of the companies who's in that full time. So that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to hear your answer to that question. That was really insightful.
Yeah, it was a great question. And I think a lot of people should know about it, because I don't think that's really communicated to the mainstream.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be talked about that much. But going into the actual way that you try and utilize solar or other types of renewable sources of energy for commercial use, you're dealing with a different type of approach from the view of curtailment. So you don't have a consistent amount of power that's being generated at all points of the day. If the sun's shining, you obviously have more energy. If you're in solar versus in natural gas, you just have a certain amount of natural gas. You can utilize that for the energy. What are some of the approaches that are being taken today by companies such as yours or others in the renewable energy industry to try and make the most of the power as it's being generated by the sun or the wind, but then in those downtimes, making sure that if there is a customer that you're trying to service, that you're able to get them all the energy that they need?
Yeah, definitely. So there's like multiple sort of approaches that I've been seeing. I mean, what we've been seeing is, obviously, we talked a little bit about energy storage. I think you're going to see a lot more of that, because it's obviously solar and wind are intermittent power sources. If you're able to then control how much of the solar energy or what goes into the grid, that's huge as far as when you talk about sort of curtailment issues that could happen. Also, really, the industry is looking for like time of use. So to basically incentivize when to basically deploy energy into the grid. I think we're also seeing as well, the industry is trying to do a better job of forecasting. So basically using satellites and weather, and then using cloud computing and data to better forecast how much output is actually going to go into the grid, and be able to communicate that with the grid operators, so then they could better manage the load and not really curtail it. I actually had a podcast interview with the company in Australia that's actually working on that, and that's incorporated that in the US market and internationally. And then what we do, like for like like behind the meter projects where you're actually putting a solar system on a business or rooftop. We always try to design the system where no matter what the variability of the load is, that the customer will be actually using it instead of selling into the grid. So, that helps too for the customer, because as you know, is once you sell into the grid, the credit that you're getting for that electricity is at wholesale rates versus the customer's obviously paying a lot more than that from the utility itself. And then I think those are kind of the major things that we're seeing. And then contracts as well, like, hey, if we have excess energy, would you agree to buy this, energy at a discounted price, which is obviously something that you guys are involved with mining, that we're seeing, companies will have like a virtual PPA with their main counterparty, but then offer like a discounted rate versus what the utility rate is out there, or the wholesale rate, so that it incentivizes, because obviously it's better to get some money for the electricity than nothing at all. So
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you actually touched on an important thing that we try and do within our business as well, is just load shedding and making sure that because with mining, you're running these machines 24/7. And I mean, that's great, especially when you are okay with shutting off a certain percentage of you're all right with shutting down your operation a certain percentage of the year, so you can maximize the amount of money that the operation can make by sending that electricity to the grid when the grid's paying extremely large amounts during those peak hours. And it's interesting to see where we're going to see that intersection between the energy sector and the mining industry, which is what we're involved in, how that's going to play out over time. I mean, have you been involved or spoken with any companies in the crypto mining space? I mean, we're in an industry that's been around for just about 10 years. So we're even younger than the solar industry.
Yeah, surprisingly, I haven't actually. I mean, obviously, you're the first crypto mining company that we've talked to, but it makes sense to me that there's a natural connection, because obviously for mining, energy cost is the huge expense, and there's an opportunity as well. And as you kind of mentioned, great, Will, about the energy company potentially making, well, you actually didn't totally talk about this, but through mining, instead of just like selling the power at a discounted rate, that they could potentially make a higher return from it. So I think it's a huge opportunity, for the energy sector, and especially too for like, solar. Like, you're normally selling during peak times, but what we're seeing though is so much solar is coming online that, especially in California and Texas and wind too, you're seeing that in Texas as well, where then you have issues with curtailment. And that's going to happen as more and more solar comes online. We're seeing that actually happening in Massachusetts as well. So I think that's huge. I think there's a huge opportunity. And I think what's happening, at least that we're seeing, there's like non-traditional businesses approaching solar companies. You mentioned mining. We've also been approached by cannabis companies as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because they have a huge like energy usage, and potentially as cannabis gets legalized, and the energy use of grow facilities as well. And I've actually been to a grow facility in California. The energy usage is just like astronomical. So, they're trying to figure out how to mitigate that with renewable energy as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm interested to hear also your perspective on what the landscape looks like today versus, I guess, pre-COVID. I'm sure that COVID has affected all parts of the world. It's affected how businesses operate, certain industries getting shut down. What have you noticed from the demand side, and how these energy companies' business models have been impacted by the government mandated shutdown and everything else that's been happening?
Yeah, it's been challenging for like, obviously the energy companies make money based on energy demand. And obviously with a lot of people working at home instead of being at offices, energy demand has gone down. I think EIA, which is like the Energy Information Agency, said that basically during COVID, electricity usage has gone down 8 or 9%, which is pretty dramatic in just a few months. And then also what we're seeing too is like energy prices and capacity payments as well have gone down. So that actually hurts like, like the project economics related to projects. So, it's been an interesting sort of shift. But at the same time too, we're seeing a lot of companies with COVID are like, hey, we have to figure out any way that we could lower our cost. So if you could do a solar project, it could lower our cost if it's third-party finance through a PPA. We definitely want to look at it, or a lease payment to use the land or unused roof. We're seeing to be more popular these days because companies are trying to figure out ways of cutting costs. So there's been, obviously both positive and negatives that have come in. But for solar, I mean, it's still obviously it's still growing exponentially, and
Yeah.
there's been a hiccup though due to COVID, obviously, with the development and essential construction, and sometimes it not being considered in certain states as essential, and then permitting and all these things taking more time.
Yeah. Do you think that it's led to any new types of opportunities that might not have been there prior? And the reason why I ask this question is because I think a lot of times people will go and they'll try and extrapolate what's going to happen in the future based on the past. And so I saw this one unbelievable metric on a company's financials where they were calling it EBITDA. So it was like EBITDA, but like prior to Corona. And
That's
so
funny.
just basically trying to beef up their numbers with a whole new type of approach. And the thing that I think is kind of crazy is that when something like this happens, it's shocking and people are all wondering what the future is going to hold. They don't know what's going to happen. But I think that this type of an event really is just changing the way that people are looking at their industry and changing the way they look at business. I mean, you mentioned a very important feature that's come of the pandemic, and it was the fact that all these companies are going to try and cut costs. They're going to try and find ways to lean out and make sure that they can keep the company profitable. By another point of view, you have many companies who are looking at new opportunities and really realizing that the landscape of business is just going to be different after this type of an event happens. For example, movie theaters and other types of public gathering places, sports and different industries that relate to entertainment might not be the same. Do you think that, and going back to the initial question, do you think that there's anything that has happened in maybe even in terms of a mind shift of energy executives or the way that people are approaching energy or renewable energy consumption, anything like that, where you think that there's going to be a paradigm shift in the industry and therefore potentially lead to new opportunities?
Yeah. There's a couple of different. That's a great question. There's a couple of different aspects to it. I think what's interesting with COVID-19 is obviously, the country's in a recession, so states and agencies and even are trying to figure out how to create stimulus to basically help the economy post COVID-19. And so what we're seeing, even just this early on in COVID, that some states have actually increased incentives for renewable energy because they think that, it's doing two goods. It's like, lowering, energy costs to whoever the customer is, but also increasing the proliferation of renewables. And then basically, like, for example, like Virginia said that they're going 100% renewable energy. That was, during COVID, as a way of stimulating like the economy in Virginia, because that'll create a lot of infrastructure being built. And that's a great way to rebound the economy. And I'm sure you're familiar, like Virginia has a huge amount of data centers. Mm-hmm. And basically the Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon are requiring 100% renewables. And then the data centers are, basically incentivizing the development of these utility scale solar projects where there's a corporate PPA. The other thing too, which I find interesting, on the real estate side, we're seeing the owners of commercial industrial real estate. I know this is relatively only a few months, but they're on the commercial industrial side wanting to include the cost of the electricity as part of the rent, which I've been saying for a very long time. And then there's like a margin that they can make off like say having a solar project there. And obviously there are other ways like through third party aggregators or brokers or procurement manager where they can make a margin from that. So they're finding ways that they can be more efficient with energy efficiency, but then also incorporating it within their lease. energy efficiency to cut costs, but then as well to make more margin off their tenants, and as from a marketing perspective to say renewable. And then in the industry, at least solar, we're seeing like in the development side, it's hard to find great like land sites for solar because it's starting to get a little saturated. So we're seeing really going to brownfields and landfills, land that can't really be used today for other uses to potentially go solar, as well photovoltaics, where you could put it on water, like different solar systems as well, even dual use on farmland, solar and farming. So like it's been interesting to see, like a lot has been happening the past 6 months, and kind of seeing like these new business models, as you say, are emerging, and even how do you message customers and in a virtual world. So we're seeing a lot of people adjusting.
Wow, that is fascinating. That is really, really interesting. I had no idea that all of that was happening.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I can't believe that's only been past few months, and there's just everyone's trying to innovate, and I think the people that are innovating and continuing to work hard during this will come up with creative solutions to keep being successful. So, yeah.
What do you think are some of those the biggest challenges that solar energy companies are facing today? I know that you touched on one of them. It's almost becoming saturated to a certain degree. So they're coming up with innovative ways to expand their operations and place more panels. But are there any other types of major challenges that these companies today are facing?
Yeah, I think the major challenges is really getting to the customer. When you talk to a residential customer, you're used to meeting them in person. And same thing when you're talking to landowners to use their land for solar, and building owners. So, companies are coming up with creative ways to be able to communicate with customers and get new business, and educating them, because a lot of it is like an education process for a customer who's not familiar with solar. And I would say, I mean, there's always like a lot of competition within the solar industry. And what ends up happening is like certain markets are hot because of certain incentives. And then everyone then kind of moves to the next state. And it's just, really kind of staying on the forefront of like, what's the different legislation? Like I was talking about, like this legislation on dual use with farmland and solar, or photovoltaics. Like it's always like pushing to the next, what's the next sort of innovation that's happening within the industry. Like everyone in the industry is trying to figure out energy storage, and then combining solar plus storage. And we're waiting for states to come out with legislation on how they're going to incentivize that. And then, once that gets kind of accepted, you're going to see a lot of development within energy storage. There hasn't been that big of a proliferation within the US. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It almost seems like these incentive programs are almost driving where the resources of these different companies are going when they're focusing on innovation. So it sounds like they're looking for these different incentives. Once they find that incentive, they go and build it, and then they go and find the next opportunity where they could potentially get additional dollars to innovate. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, that's
Okay.
a huge part of it is the state level incentive. There's going to be a time where we're at grid parity, when there's no incentives needed. And I don't think that's that far away. And that'll be a huge opportunity for the industry, because we'll grow. Now we're dependent on government regulations, which changes all the time, and it's out of your control. And the other thing that I was going to say is like, energy storage is so much more complicated than solar, meaning all the different cash flow streams that are related to the many different uses of the battery. So we think that once things are getting more and more complex, that'll weed out a lot of the competition as well. So we think solar is just such an easy, to us, it's such a standard thing. But like the financing and all this other stuff creates a lot of complex, even the development and construction, but it's not as complicated as building a commercial industrial building. But so it's exciting. But yes, you're correct in what you're saying. Well, that's a great point to mention.
If you were designing the legislation surrounding solar in particular, Are there any existing laws that you think might be preventing growth within the industry? Or are there any laws that you think should be passed that would help promote the growth of this industry within the United States?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. So there's many different challenges happening. So why it's taking longer for solar to grow in the US is that you're taking on the utility and their business model. So they're doing whatever they can to make things difficult to not get solar because it's basically competing with the service offering they're coming with. That's not all utilities. Like there's utilities that are actually going outside of their area and non-regulated and developing a lot of solar energy projects. So we think that's created like a slowdown. So you really need like the states to take the initiative and say, hey, we want to do solar. And then basically them dictating with obviously an agreement with all the different parties, the utilities and the solar companies, to come up with something that's fair. I talked about the investment tax credit and the whole thing about tax equity. That has created so much complexity within the solar industry because you have to do a lot of complicated financial structuring, like the partnership flip, sale, leaseback. It used to actually be a cash grant where you would just get a straight cash grant from the Treasury. I understand why they wouldn't want to keep it a cash grant, but if there's some legislators in Congress talking about turning into a cash grant, and I think that would actually help grow the industry because like the tax equity just creates a lot of complexity and adds a lot of costs related to the transaction, and it would be a lot simpler for projects to get done. It's just right now extremely complicated. So
interesting. Are the solar companies in other countries like China dealing with a different competitive landscape than what you just laid out of how it looks in the United States?
So we've looked at international opportunities, and it's definitely very different in every single country. It's very, very different. Like I actually don't know how like projects in China get developed and how they're incentivized. But I, know like from we actually work with a lot of international companies who are coming into the US, and they just, tell us it's just completely different. And it's a lot more complicated too, based on some of the things that I spoke about as well.
Yeah, interesting. I know that you have a lot of experience, not only just running the company that's in the solar industry, but also as a speaker, a panelist in media. What are some of the things that you try and focus on when you're going and you're speaking at these different events?
Yeah, so I'm really trying to educate, everyone, depending on the audience, like what the solar industry is about. We find that it's amazing over the past 10 years being in the industry, how many people now are understanding what the industry is about. But I think, it's just exciting to kind of see how much interest, first of all, like how many opportunities come along of people wanting to hear about the solar industry, but then it's really just educating the community and the public in general about it and the huge opportunity. I mean, we think we're really in the early stages of something that's going to be pretty popular for a very long time.
I'd like to thank BlockFi for sponsoring today's episode. BlockFi provides wealth management products for crypto investors. I personally hold my crypto with BlockFi because they pay me up to 6.2% interest annually on all of my crypto holdings. At Sazmining, we've hooked up all of our listeners with a special sign-up bonus. All you have to do is go to blockfi.com/Sazmining and sign up. Again, visit blockfi.com/Sazmining for an exclusive bonus offer. It's a no-brainer to earn additional interest with BlockFi. Today's episode is also made possible by Cogent Law Group. Finding reliable legal representation in blockchain is one of the biggest challenges when building a business. You need to make sure that you work with a law firm that understands the legal frameworks that apply to the industry and has the ability to strategically help you grow your business. When researching law firms for Sazmining, I found that Cogent Law Group checked all of the boxes. Not only do their lawyers have expert level experience, but they also understand the blockchain industry. Cogent Law Group gives you access to high-end lawyers without breaking the bank.
So moving on to the next part of the interview, it's not so deep into energy or crypto or anything else, but the question is, what is your favorite book?
Oh, what's my favorite book? Oh, so it's actually a Dale Carnegie book, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. My dad introduced me to this book maybe when I was in high school, and I had like a serious like knee injury from playing sports, and I was supposed to actually run track in college, and I just remember reading that book, and it really kind of gave me a guideline of kind of how to live your life and how to. I think most of our life we're just worried about what's going to happen and not focusing on the present and the now. And it was just a really, for me, like just seemed like it made a lot of common sense and very easy sort of strategies to follow. And everyone that I've recommended the book has really enjoyed it, even though it was like written in the 1940s or 30s. Yeah. Still like the lifelong lessons even today. So
yeah, Dale Carnegie, he put out some. He also wrote How to Win Friends and Influence People.
People. Yeah, yes, yeah. That's the other big one.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how he wrote those books that long ago. And you'd also think that the school system would incorporate at least some of those teachings into a class. I mean, you learn about all these different subjects. You learn about you take gym. You do all these other things in school, but they don't really have a class that's just geared towards improving mental health. I think that's something that would be interesting to include.
Yeah, I think it's huge. I mean, I think all schools should do some sort of, I guess mindfulness, like improving mental health. And it's surprising, like, after all these years, it hasn't been incorporated into, the school systems, which is surprising.
Do you meditate, or is it something where just throughout the day, you kind of will go into the present moment? Because you really seem like you have that presence about you, that you like practice meditation or have done it before.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, I actually got into Headspace. It's an app.
That app, yeah.
So I try to do it every day for 10 minutes a day, and it's been really helping me. I used to be extremely anxious, and when I first started doing it, I couldn't focus for like the first minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Yeah. But over time, I'm getting better and better. I mean, yes, there's days where I'm like at minute 8 and I'm not focusing on, but I think like meditation is a great like part, like that's really helped me as far as like being mindful and basically staying in the moment. And Headspace does a great job doing that. So if, people are interested, I try to do it first thing in the morning because I think that's the easiest time to get kind of settled in. Yeah. And I became anxious from doing that.
Yeah, it's crazy. Headspace also has those different categories too, where like they have one for stress relief. They have another one for creativity. They just have these different types of meditations, which I'm not sure how big of a difference it makes. I'm sure that all of them are extremely helpful, but I mean, I've found them extremely helpful for whatever I'm trying to do. It's pretty incredible what meditation can provide once someone actually gets into it. But I agree with you. Those first few minutes when you're trying to, when you're first trying to learn, first 3 minutes feel like you're sitting there for an hour.
Yes, that is so true. Well,
just like, oh my God, how is this so difficult? Like I'd rather be like running like a 5K and just like out of breath dying than just sitting there, which makes almost no sense.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. I think because we're always normally occupied, that just to have like dead time like that where we're actually thinking, I think it's we're not used to it, I feel like.
Yeah. It also made me realize how addicted I was to just my phone. Because I would always rationalize it thinking, oh, well, I'm just checking a notification on LinkedIn or some other or just checking my email, thinking that it was somewhat being productive. But then I realized that, no, that's still just like giving me a quick dopamine rush and just giving me something to do. I got to start working on my actual, my attention span, so to say, where I can just focus on something and not get distracted. That's why I put my phone on do not disturb and vibrate. So anytime someone calls, it just goes straight to voicemail. It doesn't buzz ever. And that was just a huge game changer in terms of just making it so I can take a step away and focus on something. But also when I want to go and work on something or check my phone, it's a conscious decision. It's not just me being reactive throughout the day.
That's huge. I mean, I think that makes a huge difference. I mean, I'm still trying to figure it out as well because, some days I'll be, doing that dopamine rush, and then other times I'm not. It's actually interesting because I try to schedule meetings in the afternoon because I feel like I concentrate meetings better in the morning. So I try to do like the deep work in the morning when my head's more clear. And then the afternoon, I'm on the phone most of the day, but obviously not in all circumstances that works.
Yeah.
People are always calling as well. So that's
I've actually heard about that too. You want to know who else does that? Takes that same approach? Jeff Bezos. Except he'll do his like deep work in the morning, but he'll also, if he has like a very important meeting or needs to make sure that he's showing up and doing his best in some sort of business deal or negotiation or something, he'll put those in the morning because like throughout the day, I guess you just kind of lose that not even that motivation, but just like that presence almost by the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely. And especially like after lunch too, and right after lunch, you get into a little bit of a
full and you just want to lie down, take a quick nap.
Want to nap. Yeah. But that's interesting. I didn't know Jeff Bezos does that. So that's pretty cool to hear.
Yeah. Well, it was really interesting because I was listening to one of his interviews, and he was talking about, well, obviously in the early days when you're in that startup phase and you're doing every little thing involved in all parts of the company, you're just putting in as much time as you can. But once Amazon started to scale and he realized that they had a bunch of people at the company working on these different things, he realized that his role transformed to just making a very small number of good decisions. So it wasn't about scaling out his time, but just in those few key decisions that would make the difference in Amazon's growth, making sure that he was present and made the right decisions in those particular scenarios. And so now he doesn't work those long hours. He gets a lot more rest, and he's just trying to show up and do the best in those particular cases.
Oh, that is really interesting. I didn't know about that. That actually sounds very familiar, like Mark Zuckerberg as well. He's only at the office from 9 to 5, now that they're an established company, and he's really focused on the strategic aspects of it. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Because that's the opposite of what you hear when you're an entrepreneur.
The entrepreneur life is a complete 180. You're not doing 40-hour weeks.
Yeah.
That is a myth.
That definitely is a myth. To be successful, you have to put in a lot of work, especially so.
Yeah, you got to get the engine created so it can start turning, and then you kind of get to that point where you got a lot of people and you can make those key decisions.
Yeah, definitely. That's so true.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one last question before I'm going to have you share where everyone can connect with you online. Sure. I actually want to go back to that book that you said was your favorite book of all time, and just ask you if there was one piece of advice or one core lesson that was the most valuable that you took away from that book. What would that lesson be? Yeah. So
I don't know if you've heard of they mentioned the serenity prayer. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it says basically, God's grant me the serenity to know what I could change and the serenity to know the difference. So that's like, to me, it's like such a huge thing, because if you think about it, a lot of things that we worry about or stress out in life, a lot of times we can't control it. Actually, most things in our life we can't control, but we really should focus on the things that we can control and put all our effort towards that. And that will actually make a huge difference versus worrying about things that we can't control. And, so I thought that for me, it was like just mind-blowing thing from the book. That's actually, he didn't create that itself. It's in the Bible. So, but still, it was really instrumental to me. I mean, I still am, I still have to go back to that prayer every once in a while when I'm stressing about something. So
definitely. Well, that is very deep, and that is very actionable. Something that I will definitely start thinking more about and trying to do myself. Thanks again for coming on to the podcast. This was a lot of fun. You're an unbelievably intelligent guy, and I'm really, really happy that you took the time to come on. For everyone listening, where can they connect with you or the company online?
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, Will, for having me on the podcast. This has been an amazing interview, and you asked great questions and had great follow-ups too. And I've been on many interviews. So thank you for having me on your podcast. How you could find us, it's Reneu Energy, RENEU energy.com. And then The email is info@renewenergy.com. You could also find me on LinkedIn, and it's Benoy Thanjan. And look forward to hearing from everyone.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sazmining podcast. Be sure to follow us on social media and YouTube for the latest updates and previews of upcoming episodes. Full episodes and transcripts can be found on sazmining.com every Thursday. If you want to hear us interview a particular guest on a future episode, please reach out to us at podcast@sazmining.com.